Welcome to the Research Like a Pro with DNA question and answer series. Today we are answering the question, how do you generate hypotheses in What Are the Odds or WATO Plus? WATO Plus is a great tool at DNApainter.com that allows you to put in a descendancy tree of a known descent group, like the Harris line, and then find out how an unknown DNA test taker fits into that group. And so for my example, I'm using the Harris family on my mom's side, and I'm going to be using a match who I found in my mom's shared matches. So I found Grace here, and I think she's a descendant of the Harris line. And so let's go to the shared matches and see if we can see how Diana and Grace are related. So let's go ahead and sort by Grace's relationship with the shared matches so that we can see if any of her closest matches will tell us where she fits into the Harris descendancy. So sorting by Grace's relationship, we can see that her closest match here is John. And John and Diana are actually second cousins once removed. And John and Grace, the estimate is that they are second cousins or maybe half first cousins once removed. And John is indeed a descendant of Diana's Harris line, and he is a descendant of John C. Harris and Melissa Welch. So that is a good hypothesis that Grace is also descended from the Harris line. And looking closer at Grace and John, they share 269 centimorgans. And so what's interesting about this is that John, he's actually someone who's shared his DNA results with me. And so I have access to view his matches. He's my mom's second cousin once removed. He's one generation closer to John C. Harris and Melissa Welch than my mom is. So the relationships that Ancestry predicts that John and Grace could have are second cousin or half first cousin once removed, half second cousin, first cousin once removed, or half grand uncle. Now going back to look at the shared matches between Grace and Diana, I can see that the colored dots that I have given to many of these matches are in the Harris line. So first John is that teal Harris Welch dot, and then later M is a Harris Hoosier match, which is one generation further back. John C. Harris's parents were James Harris and Martha Hoosier. And so we see that darker green H. And then down below, R is also a Harris-Hoosier match that I've identified in the past and given that green Harris dot. So I can see that the match with Grace is clearly from my mom's Harris line. Now, because John was her closest match, I went ahead and looked at his tree and saw that the Harris great-grandparents of John are John Christian Harris and Melissa Welch, and that probably is the common ancestor with Grace, because it said in the prediction for 269 centimorgans that those people are probably second cousins or maybe first cousins once removed, which would take us back to first great-grandparents. But because so many of the shared matches were going back another generation to James B. Harris and Martha Hoosier, I'm also circling them as a possible common ancestral couple. Now, when I looked at John's matches and his shared matches with Grace, I noticed something interesting. And that was that there was another kind of genetic network of matches descending from the Kitchens Gray line. And so I kind of worried that maybe John and Grace shared two common ancestors. So now I have this hypothesis that Grace and John are actually sharing two sets of common ancestral couples. And as I looked in the shared matches between Grace and John, I saw that some of the matches were through John's parent 1, and some of the matches were through John's parent 2 side. And so my hypothesis then is that the parent 2 side is where the Harris-Hoosier matches are. And what I decided to do is to not use John in What Are the Odds, because if John shares multiple common ancestors with Grace, then it won't work with What Are the Odds. What Are the Odds doesn't work well with people who share multiple relationships, like in the case of pedigree collapse. So what I can do if I do want to use John and analyze the amount of DNA he shares with Grace. Then I can, after I am done using what are the odds to generate hypotheses, then I can export that as a GEDcom and import that into Banyan DNA. And so that's one use of both of the tools. But for now, we're just going to focus on finding out where Grace belongs in the Harris descendancy using what are the odds. So I will look at John's shared matches with Grace, and anytime there's a match that's linked to his parent 2 side, then I will be able to use that as long as they don't also share the Kitchens Gray ancestry. Okay, I'm ready to begin my WATO Plus tree. And so the first thing you do is fill out all of the fields on the left here. And if you leave any of them blank, it will prompt you that you need to fill them in. So I put in that I would like to identify the biological parent of Grace. And I didn't know when Grace was born, and her ancestry profile didn't say, so I just guessed 1950. I just had to put in an estimate, and you can't leave that blank. And then I am using the DNA matches of this person, Grace. Now, one of the uses for what are the odds is if you have a mystery match, and this mystery match shares DNA with more than one person in my tree. And it says here on the right, you can use WATO Plus to explore how this match might connect to your existing family tree. This will work best if the family members who share DNA with the match are no more closely related to each other than first cousins. Use shared matches to narrow down which branch of your tree the match is likely to connect on. So where it says enter a name, enter the name of the match. If you can see that the match has an unknown parent, specify that you're seeking the biological father or mother. Otherwise, leave the drop down as parent. So in this case, Grace didn't have a tree at all. So I'm just putting that I don't know who her parent is at all. And then in the born in the year field, enter an estimated or guessed birth year for the match. And then if you scroll down on this page, it tells you what to put for the section where it says, I am using the DNA matches of, and it just said to leave it as this person, Grace. So we need to have the amount of DNA Grace shares with other people in the descendancy tree of the Harris line. So because I have Ancestry Pro Tools and the shared matches there show me how much Grace shares with the other matches, I can do this. But if you don't have Pro Tools at Ancestry, you won't be able to unless Grace shared her matches with me, and then I would be able to do it. All right, now I'm ready. I gave this WATO tree a name, Grace's Harris Ancestors. And then the next thing that you need to do is click on the box that says most recent common ancestor or couple, and then just start typing their names. And then that's how you start building the tree in What Are the Odds. So I typed in John Christian Harris and Melissa Welch, and then I put in John's great-grandmother, Margaret C. Harris, and then my mom's great-great-grandfather, Doc Harris, or great-grandfather. And then I realized that all this typing was going to take forever. I already have this in my tree, so I thought I would try the import GEDcom method. So I went over to my family tree maker tree that syncs with my ancestry tree, and I went ahead and exported a GEDcom of all of the descendants of James B. Harris. Then go back to WATO and click Actions and Settings in the top right there. And after you do that, you can click Import GEDcom. After you do that, you'll see this Load GEDcom pop-up box, and you can choose the file location, and then it will ask you to type a name and click on the result to select someone. Only people with descendants will appear. So this is actually great because you can use your full GEDcom and then you can just only import the part that you need. So after you choose the person whose descendants you want to import, you can then click on a section of which ones you want to import, all descendants or just those who could have inherited X, or X DNA from James, X DNA from Martha, just male or Y DNA descendants, or just mitochondrial descendants. And then for privacy, you can select to replace the names of living people with their initials or import the names of details of living people as is. So those are great options that you can have. I decided to import the names as is so I would know who they are, but then I changed some of them for this video for privacy. So after importing the GEDcom, I saw a really tall vertical tree with James B. Harris on the left and all of his many children in the next row, and then their children and then their grandchildren and all of that. Well, you can go to Actions and Settings in WATO and change the view to be horizontal. So I went ahead and tried that as well, just to see which one I would like better. So the horizontal tree was very wide, and it reminded me of the lucid chart diagrams that I like to make when I'm figuring out who matches are in my tree. So this was a great view as well. And you can see at the bottom there the slider bar and how wide this tree is. I'm in the middle of the tree, so I can see the very top of it is James B. Harris. And then as I scroll to the left, I see the oldest children of James B. Harris. And if I scroll all the way to the right, I see the youngest children of James B. Harris. So this is a huge diagram because I have so many descendants of James B. Harris that I've put into my tree that it's a little bit too big and unwieldy. So I went through and I deleted some of the names where it just said living because I had a whole bunch of those that had been brought over from a different tree back when my mom and I used to use Ancestral Quest, I believe, or PAF. And when we used to use that, and then once when we exported the tree, it privatized everyone as living, and so we still had some of those descendants listed as living here. So I went through and just kind of pruned out all of those, and that helped to make the tree a little more easy to navigate around and see, but it was still really big. One thing to be really careful about with what are the odds is half relationships. And when I first started using what are the odds, my very first time, I didn't know how to define half relationships. And if you don't do that correctly, it can really skew the results because half siblings and half cousins are sharing less DNA than full. And so if you don't define those, then what are the odds might give you probabilities that are not accurate. So it's really important to recognize when you have a person with multiple spouses and half children who are half siblings to each other. So for example, in this image, you can see James A. Harris had two wives. His first wife was Mary Clementine Alford, and their daughter was Martha Frances Harris. And so as you can see, Martha Frances Harris is a half relationship to her siblings Ella, Purvi, Eva, and Oba, and those are shown by the blue lines and the word half. You can define half relationships by clicking on the person and then clicking Define Half Relationships, then checking the box next to all of the siblings who that person shares a half relationship with. Now if I click on Ella, I can see she's the child of James' second wife, Daisy Duncombe. And so Ella is full siblings with Purvi, Eva, Oba, and so forth, but a half sibling with Martha. So Martha has the black line, and Ella and her full siblings all share the blue line. So it's important to understand how to do that. Okay, so after you've got your tree here, you can start adding DNA matches and the amounts of shared DNA. Remember that you're putting in the amount of shared DNA that these matches share with Grace. So even though I'm looking at my mom, Diana's DNA test, and I can see the amount that these matches share with her, I'm also looking at the shared matches between my mom and Grace, so I can see how much these matches share with Grace too. So make sure you put in the correct amount. And so here's an example of a match OH, where I put in the amount of DNA that Grace and OH share, which is 146 centimorgans. And once you put in an amount of DNA, it turns to this tan color. Here's how you add a match amount. So you click on the person, and then you click Enter Match Centimorgans. Then you type in the amount of DNA that they share and click Save. I noticed that many of the matches that I found for Grace were through James Harris's daughter, Louisa. And so there were a lot of matches, and these were higher matches as well, sharing over 100 and under 300 centimorgans of DNA. So I started noticing a pattern which caused me to develop a hypothesis that perhaps Grace also belonged as a descendant in Louisa Harris's line. As I went through all of the shared matches between Grace and my mom, and then Grace and John, I found that there were a lot of matches to descendants of Louisa, and some matches to descendants of Samuel, and some to descendants of John Christian and William Burrell. And some others only had one, and then several had zero. So this is a list of all of the children of James B. Harris and his wife Martha. And next to it in pink, you're seeing the number of matches that I found as matches to Grace. in the shared matches. And where there are 0, that will be a challenge for what are the odds to know if Grace could have come from that branch. So I would have liked to find matches to the other branches that have 0, but I don't have a full match list for Grace. I'm just working with the shared match list between her and my mom and between her and John. So that was limiting. However, I did go and look in through lines for my mom to see if there are matches to my mom for each of these children, and there are, and there's several. So all of these descendants of James B. Harris, all of his children, have descendants who've taken a DNA test at Ancestry. Except maybe, I think maybe Martha didn't have any, but all of the other ones did, and they all matched my mom. So in theory, if I were able to look at Grace's test, I would probably see matches to all of the branches. But because I was only seeing the shared matches with my mom and John, I was limited. So I did have a hypothesis that perhaps Louisa is the right branch for Grace, just because there were more matches to her descendants and also higher matches. So the next step, now that I have all of the DNA matches that share DNA with Grace from my mom and John's test in WATO, now we're going to go ahead and suggest hypotheses for where Grace might fit into this descendancy diagram. So clicking on Suggest Hypotheses brings us to this waiting page where it says Suggesting Hypotheses. Then the results page says 74 hypotheses suggested. And so looking at that green rectangle on the left, it says it suggested 74. And then at the bottom of the green rectangle, it said WATO had to stop suggesting early, either because the tree is very large or because the centimorgan amounts entered suggested a wide variety of possibilities. And so that was not what I had hoped would happen, unfortunately. So because the tree was so big and there were so many people in the tree, and WATO was adding different possible half relationships and children here and there, it got stuck and couldn't do any more than that. But it did say that you can fix this by checking Stop WATO Adding Unknown People to the Tree to reduce the number of possibilities. So just to see where it stopped, I zoomed out as far as I could and looked at the tree, and I saw that all the teal boxes in the diagram were the hypotheses, and it was able to generate, starting at the left, moving toward the right, about 2/3 of the way through the descendancy diagram. Then it stopped generating hypotheses. Well, Louisa's on the right of the descendancy diagram, and so her branch is there, and so it didn't even get over to Louisa's branch, sadly. So I didn't feel like this was representative of where Grace would be yet. So I went ahead and went back to Actions and Settings, and then I checked the box for Stop WATO from Adding Unknown People to the Tree, and then I clicked Regenerate Hypotheses to see if I could get it to generate hypotheses for the whole diagram and not just for the ones on the left. So then it looked at the people that were already in the tree and chose those as hypotheses, and it gave me a strong hypothesis that Grace descended from any of those children of James B. Harris who didn't have any matches. So basically saying for Margaret and Millie, those children of James B. Harris, those could be the branches where Grace belongs. But I didn't feel like this was quite right. As I looked down at all of the hypotheses, I did see that these first 3 here, hypothesis 10, 60, and 68, were just picking the children of James B. Harris where there were no matches. So there were no matches to James' daughter Margaret, or Benjamin, or Sarah Jane, and so it had just suggested that maybe Grace falls here. Then it even added a child. Well, I went in and I added a child of Amelia because it skipped over Amelia, and she also didn't have any DNA matches in her branch. So when I went ahead and added another child of Amelia as a hypothesis, it gave her a 23% chance of being the mother of Grace or father of Grace. So I thought that was interesting as well. But I still felt like the hypotheses neglected to really show that there were higher possibility of Louisa's branch being the place where Grace would fit. And that was probably because I need to add more hypotheses. And since I turned off the setting for creating new people for hypotheses, then I felt like I was missing some of those. What I decided to do was duplicate the tree and then delete out almost all of the siblings of Louisa to really focus in on just that one branch. So if Louisa is the source, is the branch where Grace belongs, I wanted to focus in on that and then suggest hypotheses there so that I could uncheck the button to stop WATO from adding unknown people to the tree. I really wanted WATO to add those unknown people to the tree and suggest hypotheses so I could really get a more clear picture of where Grace could fit within this Harris descendancy. So in my new WATO tree, where I unchecked the box allowing WATO to create new hypotheses and new positions in the tree, I also kept James B. Harris as the highest ancestor, so WATO could add children of James B. Harris, allowing for hypotheses where Grace descends from a different child besides Louisa. But when I clicked on Suggest Hypotheses or Regenerate Hypotheses, all of the top hypotheses are Louisa's descendants. And so I thought, finally, this makes sense. And it was really interesting to see possibilities for where Grace could fit in the descendancy of James B. Harris. And clearly the most likely scenario is that Grace fits in as a descendant of Louisa, James's daughter. So I annotated the first 4 here. The first hypothesis, hypothesis 65, that gets the highest ranking, is that an unknown child of Louisa is the biological parent of Grace. And when I looked at this in the WATO tree, WATO had added a half-sibling to Louisa's other children. And what the historical records show is that Louisa was only married once and that she didn't have any children with other men. So there's always the possibility that that did occur. But if I want to go ahead and follow what the documentary evidence is showing at this point, I'm going to eliminate that one because as far as I know, there are no half-siblings of Louisa's other children. So then the next hypothesis, number 50, is that an unknown child of James Aaron Monroe, was the biological parent of Grace. So looking in the tree, James Monroe's position is that he's a son of Louisa Harris, and I had not found any matches to Grace in this branch. So if I did find a match to this branch, then maybe it would show a high amount of centimorgans. But I would have to do additional testing. And then hypothesis 63 is also 22% likely, and this is that an unknown child of Rosa Monroe was the biological parent of Grace. And Rosa is another child of Louisa, and there are no DNA matches to Grace on her branch. So I could do more testing there. And then hypothesis 25 is a little bit less likely. This one has 8%, and it says that an unknown child of Lee Monroe was the biological parent of Grace. And this is another child of Louisa, and there is one DNA match to Lee's great-grandson that shares 100 centimorgans with Grace. So the higher scores mean a higher likelihood that that hypothesis is correct. However, the most likely hypothesis is not always correct. So I think I can eliminate the first one, but the next 3 I think are all possible. And I think that it gives me kind of a place to build the descendancy of Louisa and find living descendants of James, Rosa, and Lee to see if I can find the family of Grace. And then I'll be able to place her correctly on the tree. Now going down all of these other hypotheses here are through different descendants of Louisa in the Monroe family. And even as I scroll down even further, the rest of these hypotheses are also still within the Monroe family, except for hypothesis 16 is an unknown child of Martha Harris, so one of the siblings of Louisa. And then hypothesis 68, WATO added an unknown child of James B. Harris as the biological parent of Grace. And this one has such a low likelihood that it really probably doesn't need to be considered. But the rest down here are all in the descendancy of Louisa. They're all part of the Monroe family. So pretty much every hypothesis that's possible is a descendant of Louisa. So looking at the diagram to see how WATO added various people here, you can see in the top right that hypothesis 68 is if James B. Harris had a child with another woman, then this could be like a half sibling to the other Harris children, so like Louisa's half sibling, and then that could be potentially a parent of Grace, but that's a less than 1% chance. So you can see how in this this time where I generated the hypotheses with WATO focusing on Louisa's branch and eliminating some of the other siblings just to focus in, this was the one where I had the most success getting possibilities that made sense. And this was because there weren't too many people in the tree, so it could still suggest the hypotheses, and then it could compare them to each other. I hope this was helpful, learning how to suggest hypotheses with what are the odds, and thinking about how what are the odds can be helpful for figuring out where an unknown match in your tree belongs. Good luck to you.